December 7th, 2003. Montgomery, Alabama. 19-year-old LaQuanta Riley stops off at her mother's residence to borrow a jacket from her brother, who sees LaQuanta leave in a dark green car being driven by an unidentified man. LaQuanta goes missing, and a few weeks later, her mother receives a garbled message on her answering machine from a panicked woman whom she believes is LaQuanta, and a male voice can be heard in the background. Even though a number of leads are explored, including LaQuanta's name showing up on an apartment rental in Georgia, no trace of her is ever found. After that, the trail went cold. Hello everyone, and welcome to our latest episode of The Trail Went Cold. I'm your host Robin Werder, and on this episode, we're going to be exploring a pair of unsolved missing persons cases from Alabama: the 2003 disappearance of LaQuanta Riley and the 2010 disappearance of Tarasha Benjamin. I've received requests to cover both of these cases, as both victims were young African-American women, and I thought it might be appropriate to feature them on the same episode together, since Tarasha Benjamin went missing from Selma and LaQuanta Riley went missing from the state capital of Montgomery. And of course, it was 60 years ago next month, when the iconic Selma to Montgomery protest marches led by Martin Luther King Jr. took place. As for the two victims, LaQuanta Riley was a bright 19-year-old who had plans to attend college, but went missing after she was last seen climbing into a dark green car being driven by an unidentified man. However, evidence would soon surface to suggest that LaQuanta may have been alive for a period of time after she disappeared, as her mother received a panicked message on her answering machine from a woman she believed was LaQuanta, and she sounded like she was in the midst of a confrontation with a man. LaQuanta's name also turned up on an apartment rental in her former hometown of Stone Mountain, Georgia, but by the time this lead was investigated, the woman who was using LaQuanta's name had apparently moved out, and it's never been officially confirmed if it was her. In regards to Tarasha Benjamin, she was a 17-year-old who vanished after borrowing her friend's SUV to take a seemingly routine visit to a flea market, but she never returned, and the abandoned SUV would be found next to the Cecil Jackson Bypass with a broken door handle and two windows missing. It appears that Tarasha had been the victim of an abduction, but no trace of her has ever been found, and over the past 15 years, there seem to have been some unsubstantiated rumors that some sort of cover-up took place. So on this episode, I'm going to start out by sharing the details of LaQuanta's case before I move on to my theories and analysis, and then I'll do the same thing with Tarasha's case. However, before we get started, just a quick reminder that The Trail Went Cold is a weekly podcast, which is currently available for download on several platforms, including Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, YouTube Music, Podcast Addict, and more. So if you like this podcast, be sure to subscribe to it, and please leave us a rating or review on any of those sites to help spread the word and garner us more exposure. The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so if you would like to learn how to support the show, please visit our page at patreon.com/thetrailwentcold. For as little as $1 a month, you can garner access to exclusive rewards, including stickers and thank you cards, early access to episodes, and bonus content, as our Patreon page has around 80 exclusive bonus episodes and archives which are not available on our regular feed. So with all that out of the way, let us now explore the disappearance of LaQuanta Riley. Our first story begins in 2003, and our first victim is 19-year-old LaQuanta Riley. LaQuanta's mother, Pam Riley Bolden, was only 16 years old when she gave birth to her, and did not believe she could handle the responsibility of a newborn baby at that time. Pam had already endured a major tragedy at the age of 4 when her own mother was murdered, so LaQuanta would be raised by her great-aunt, Katie Smith, who lived in Atlanta, Georgia. However, LaQuanta still kept in touch with her birth mother and maintained a good relationship with her. Pam went on to have 4 sons and another daughter named Kamisha, but experienced additional trauma after Kamisha was molested at the age of 4 by a man who was HIV positive. As a result, the virus wound up being passed on to Kamisha, and she died of AIDS at the age of 9. LaQuanta eventually decided to pay tribute to her younger sister by having the words R.I.P. Misha tattooed on one of her biceps. At this particular point, LaQuanta is described as having a bubbly, caring, and compassionate personality, and has recently graduated as an honor student at Redan High School in Stone Mountain, which is a suburb of Atlanta. She has received a full college scholarship and is hoping to study criminal justice and pursue a career in forensic science. At some point, LaQuanta decided to relocate to Eufaula, Alabama, to share an apartment with a high school friend of hers, but they apparently got into some sort of disagreement, so at around Thanksgiving in 2003, she decided she wanted to move out. LaQuanta then decided to move back in with her great-aunt Katie, who was now residing in Montgomery, where Pam also happened to live. On December the 5th, LaQuanta took the 85-mile trip back to Eufaula to collect some belongings from her old apartment, but later that day she phoned her mother. Pam said that LaQuanta sounded quite upset and asked her if she could come pick her up and bring her back to Montgomery. Pam was unable to do so at that time, so LaQuanta got a ride with someone else, but Pam never did find out what happened in Eufaula to make her daughter so upset. When LaQuanta moved in with her great-aunt Katie, she was informed that there was a firm rule about her not being allowed to bring any men home. On December the 7th, Katie was away visiting relatives in Georgia when she received a phone call from LaQuanta, who informed her that she had just gotten into an argument with Katie's son about the no men rule. Katie told LaQuanta not to worry about the argument before the call ended, but this would turn out to be the last time they ever spoke. Later that evening, at around 11:30 p.m., LaQuanta left Katie's residence and traveled to her mother's house, which was located on Hill Street in the Westview Gardens neighborhood 3 miles away. Pam was not home at the time, so one of LaQuanta's brothers, Dana Riley, answered the door, and LaQuanta asked if she could borrow a jacket. Dana asked how LaQuanta arrived there since she did not own a car or a cell phone. LaQuanta replied that she got a ride from some guy she met from around the street, but never provided this person's name. She then pointed to a vehicle parked outside, which Dana would later describe as a dark green 4-door car, possibly a Ford Taurus or Chevrolet Caprice. Dana told LaQuanta that she had never seen her ride in a car like that before and asked who the driver was, but LaQuanta said she was in a rush and did not want to talk. Dana then gave LaQuanta a jacket before she left and climbed into the car, but after it drove away, this would turn out to be the last time LaQuanta was officially confirmed to be alive. LaQuanta never returned to Katie's residence, and even though she was scheduled to go Christmas shopping with her mother the following day, she never showed up or made any attempt to contact her. When LaQuanta failed to resurface by December the 10th, Pam officially reported her missing to the Montgomery Police Department. LaQuanta's family said that it was very uncharacteristic of her to take off and not tell anyone where she was, which seemed to be supported by the fact that she left her purse and money behind at her great-aunt's residence and did not pick up her last paycheck from her job. However, about a week after her daughter disappeared, Pam returned home to find a strange garbled message on her answering machine. While she couldn't make out what was being said, Pam said that she heard a young woman crying and either saying, quote, "Leave me alone," or, quote, "Let me go home." This was followed by what sounded like a male voice saying the name LaQuanta in the background before the call abruptly disconnected, but Pam was certain that the female voice on the message was her missing daughter. Pam said that she informed the police about the call, and 2 detectives were able to make an audio recording of it, but the message wound up being erased from the machine after a power outage. Months later, there would be another promising lead when investigators learned that LaQuanta's name had been used to rent an apartment in Stone Mountain, Georgia, which is where LaQuanta had previously attended high school and was located 175 miles away from Montgomery. This prompted Pam to travel to Stone Mountain and speak to the current resident of the apartment, who claimed he had been living there for 2 years. When Pam showed him a photograph of LaQuanta, he said he recognized her and that she had lived at another apartment down the hall from him. In fact, he also said there was an incident where she stopped by and asked to use the phone because she had gotten into some sort of fight. But unfortunately, this young woman had apparently moved out just a few days before Pam arrived, and the resident did not know her current whereabouts. Even though LaQuanta Riley's name was listed in the apartment building's database, investigators were never able to confirm if she actually rented the apartment or if it was someone else using her identity. In December of 2008, Pam did an interview with the Montgomery Advertiser in which she expressed her bitterness over the fact that she felt that she had to do most of the investigating into LaQuanta's disappearance on her own, as she claimed that police never performed a search of the house where LaQuanta was staying at the time she went missing or checked phone records. There's also been some confusion about whether the Montgomery PD still have the audio of the aforementioned answering machine message or if they wound up losing it. In April of 2014, a former Montgomery police detective named M. Dante Gordon stated during an interview that when he first started working on the case in 2005, he was told about the message, but the audio was never provided to him. Interestingly enough, Gordon also said that when detectives attempted to interview everyone LaQuanta knew at the time of her disappearance, no one wanted to cooperate and speak with them. In 2016, Pam started the Riley Relief Foundation, a non-profit organization which functions as a support group for the families of missing children. Every year on the anniversary of LaQuanta's disappearance, Pam has always made it an annual tradition to organize a prayer and praise candlelight vigil in Montgomery, which is attended by the families of missing children from all over the state and used as an outlet to publicly read out the names of as many missing Alabamas as they can. Sadly, on February 2, 2020, Pam would experience yet another major tragedy when her son, Dana Riley, the last known person to see LaQuanta alive, was shot to death at the age of 31. Thankfully, this crime would not remain a cold case for very long, as a 60-year-old suspect named Lorenzo Rayner was charged with Dana's murder 2 months later. In December of 2023, to commemorate the 20-year anniversary of LaQuanta's disappearance, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children released a new age progression image of what LaQuanta might look like if she was still alive at the age of 39. But after 2 decades, LaQuanta Riley continues to remain a missing person. So I guess you could say, the trail went cold. So a recurring theme you're going to see in LaQuanta's case and my upcoming discussion about the disappearance of Tarasha Benjamin is that both of the victims' families had to endure a lot of tragedy. In addition to losing LaQuanta, Pam Riley lost another daughter to AIDS and experienced the ordeal of having her mother and one of her sons get murdered. Pam also gave birth to LaQuanta when she was way too young to be raising children, but in spite of this, she was able to maintain a strong relationship with her, and by all accounts, LaQuanta grew up into a very kind and bright young woman, and since she had an interest in criminal justice and forensic science, perhaps she would have eventually found a career working on cold cases like this had she not gone missing. Pam has gone through more trauma than most people will ever experience in their lifetime, so it's great that she's been able to persevere and become an amazing advocate for her daughter and the families of other missing children. Like I mentioned earlier, Pam has complained that there are times when she felt she had to do more investigative work than the police, and there are certain aspects of this case which are frustratingly vague, and I definitely have a lot of unanswered questions. One of the only things we know for certain is that LaQuanta's brother Dana last saw her climbing into a dark green car, which was apparently being driven by a man whom LaQuanta did not name and has never been identified. I don't think Dana ever saw this man, but if his account is accurate, it seems obvious that the driver of the car was likely responsible for LaQuanta's disappearance, but there is evidence to suggest that she was still alive for a period of time after she went missing. We know that LaQuanta had recently relocated to Montgomery and had only been living in her great-aunt Katie's residence for a short time before she went missing. Katie apparently had a firm rule that LaQuanta couldn't bring any men back to her house while she was staying there, so if LaQuanta became involved with someone, This could explain why she decided to leave and go off with this person at 11:30 p.m. I previously made mention of a comment by one of the former detectives on this case, M. Dante Gordon, who claimed that many of the people LaQuanta knew at the time were uncooperative and did not want to speak with the police. I mean, this could have stemmed from a general distrust they had about law enforcement, but it does make me wonder if some people know more about LaQuanta's disappearance than they are letting on and could shed some light on the whole situation. For starters, I'd like to know more about this alleged disagreement LaQuanta had with her former high school friend. As you recall, after being raised in Georgia and graduating from high school there, LaQuanta decided to move to Eufaula and share an apartment with this friend, but for some unknown reason, they seemed to have a falling out, so LaQuanta decided to move in with her great aunt in Montgomery. And then, just 2 days before her disappearance, LaQuanta returned to Eufaula to collect her belongings, but then called her mother sounding quite upset and asking her to come pick her up. Since this would turn out to be their last conversation, Pam has always said that her biggest regret was not pushing LaQuanta for more information about what was bothering her. Of course, it's possible that LaQuanta's reaction was over a personal issue completely unrelated to her disappearance, and it's just a coincidence that she turned up missing a short time later, but the timing of the situation is definitely odd. Could the unidentified man in the green car have been someone that LaQuanta originally met in Eufaula? Possibly, but when LaQuanta's brother asked about him, she replied that it was some guy she met from around the street. That would imply that the driver lived in Montgomery, but who knows if LaQuanta was even telling the truth. Now, the two pieces of evidence that suggest that LaQuanta could have been alive for a period of time after she went missing are the strange message on Pam's answering machine and LaQuanta's name being used to rent an apartment in Stone Mountain, Georgia. Even though the answering machine message was garbled, Pam believed that she could make out what sounded like a young woman crying and saying something like, quote, "leave me alone," or, quote, "let me go home." Pam was certain it was her daughter's voice, which seemed to be supported by the fact that she also heard a male in the background saying LaQuanta, which is not the most common name in the world. The way this message was described, it sounds like the woman may have been in trouble and attempting to make a call for help before this man cut her off. Now, I have seen other cases like this in which a missing victim has supposedly made a phone call sometime after they disappeared. A primary example of this would be the 1986 disappearance of 9-year-old Antoinette Cayadito, which we covered on episode number 229, as a girl claiming to be her made a frantic emergency call to the police asking for help before an unidentified man was heard yelling at her in the background and the call was abruptly cut off. The audio of this call was released to the public in hopes that it might compel someone to come forward with new information, but even though the message left on Pam's answering machine sounded quite similar, the audio has never been played anywhere. In fact, there's some question about whether the Montgomery PD even still has the audio recording of this message in their possession, or if it wound up going missing. Pam also made a statement about the police never checking phone records, and if this means that they didn't look to see where the call to Pam's answering machine originated from, then that's pretty egregious. I mean, if they were able to determine that the call came from Stone Mountain, that would be a pretty good indicator that LaQuanta went there and rented an apartment. So it definitely seems like too much of a coincidence that LaQuanta's name would show up on an apartment rental in Stone Mountain, as she went to high school there, and I'm sure LaQuanta Riley is not a particularly common name. But the other possibility is that it could have been rented by someone who stole LaQuanta's identity. After all, if LaQuanta was abducted and being held against her will, I doubt her captor would have let her rent this place under her own name. But when Pam showed LaQuanta's photograph to another resident from the apartment building, he did recognize her and confirmed that she lived down the hall, and even said that she stopped and asked to use the phone after some sort of fight. It's not entirely clear to me if this guy allowed the woman to do this, but the answering machine message suggested that LaQuanta was trapped in a potentially abusive situation and trying to call for help, so it makes sense that she might go elsewhere to try to use the phone without her captor finding out about it. If LaQuanta made the call to her mother's answering machine from that apartment building, I can see why she might have been forced to move out of there so abruptly, as her captor may have feared that someone would eventually trace the call there. The fact that Pam personally traveled to Stone Mountain to explore this angle makes me wonder how thoroughly the police looked into the apartment rental, because surely there must have been a paper trail for this sort of thing. It's never been made clear if the record showed LaQuanta renting the apartment before or after she went missing. You generally need to provide a lot of documentation when you rent an apartment, so it should have been relatively easy to determine if LaQuanta was actually there or not, and it makes me wonder if we're getting the whole story. By all accounts, LaQuanta was described as being a very responsible young woman, so it sounds like it would have been quite out of character for her to skip town and break off all contact with her family and leave a number of her personal items behind, including her purse. While I have my doubts that an abductor would allow LaQuanta to rent an apartment under her own name, I suppose the alternate possibility is that LaQuanta fell head over heels in love with some guy and decided to move to Stone Mountain with him. But once they moved into a new place, the relationship turned sour, as perhaps this guy wound up being controlling and abusive, so LaQuanta made an attempt to call her mother for help before he intervened. Once again, it sounds like it would have been uncharacteristic for LaQuanta to do something like this, but anything's possible. It's frustrating to hear that many people who knew LaQuanta were unwilling to speak to the police, because I just have so many questions here. While her family have never said anything about her being involved with another man at that time, does anyone else from her personal life have knowledge of this? Was LaQuanta's former friend and roommate from Eufaula one of the people who was described as being uncooperative? The vehicle LaQuanta was seen climbing into was described as being a dark green four-door car, possibly a Ford Taurus or Chevrolet Caprice, so did anybody associated with LaQuanta drive a vehicle matching that description? If LaQuanta did go back to Stone Mountain, it's possible she originally met the driver of the car while she was living in Georgia, and he drove to Montgomery to pick her up. This could explain why no one from Montgomery seems to have any idea who he might be. There doesn't seem to be any paper trail for LaQuanta after she moved out of the apartment in Stone Mountain, so if she was abducted against her will or got trapped in some sort of abusive relationship, I have a feeling she might have wound up dead a short time later. Nevertheless, Pam has always held out hope that LaQuanta might still be alive somewhere, and she will never stop searching for her. Pam has used her own tragedy as an outlet to help the families of other missing children, but it would still be nice if she finally received conclusive answers about what happened to her own daughter. So if you happen to have any information about the disappearance of LaQuanta Riley, please contact the Montgomery Police Department at 334-241-2651. That's 334-241-2651. And now let's move on to our next case. Our second story takes place in Selma, Alabama in 2010, and our second victim is 17-year-old Tarasha Benjamin. Tarasha often went by the nickname Pooh, spelled P-O-O-H like Winnie the Pooh, and even had that nickname tattooed on her upper right arm. Tarasha currently lives with her mother, Regina Benjamin, and is her youngest child, but much like LaQuanta Riley and her family, the Benjamins have endured a lot of tragedy. In 1996, Tarasha lost two of her older sisters, who were 3 and 4 years old at the time, when they were both killed in a house fire. In September of 2009, Tarasha's 42-year-old father, Clyde Chandler, went missing while suffering from the apparent effects of alcohol withdrawal syndrome. Clyde was trying to clean up his life and taking medication to help him detox, but before he vanished, he was last seen shaking and talking to himself while walking down a road. He remained a missing person for 2 weeks, but on September the 28th, Clyde's body was found behind a restaurant called the Steak Pit, and it's unclear if investigators were able to determine how exactly he died. Well, 9 months later, on Saturday, June the 26th, 2010, Tarasha told her mother that she was planning to visit the Selma Flea Market, as she liked to go there every Saturday in order to find bargains. She was picked up by her friend, Talisha Guyvan, sometime between 9:30 and 10 a.m., and they left together in Talisha's gray Mazda Tribute SUV. By 11 a.m., Tarasha had still not returned home, and Regina said she had a gut feeling in her body that something was wrong, so she tried calling her daughter on her cell phone, but the calls kept going straight to voicemail. When she failed to hear back from Tarasha, Regina started phoning friends and relatives to ask if they had seen her. One family friend told Regina that she had seen Tarasha driving a gray SUV through her neighborhood on Small Street at around 10:30 a.m. before she turned a corner, but surprisingly, she said that Tarasha was alone. Regina soon spoke to one of her cousins and shared the details about the SUV, but the cousin said that she had just spotted an SUV matching that description. It was parked by the side of the road on the Cecil Jackson Bypass near an American Apparel store about a mile north from the Selma Flea Market, but no one was inside. At around 1 p.m., Tarasha Benjamin arrived at the Benjamin residence after being driven there by another friend. She informed Regina that something came up for her that morning while they were driving to the flea market, so she climbed out of the SUV and allowed Tarasha to borrow it in order to drive there herself. Tarasha had shown up, expecting to collect the SUV back from Tarasha, but was surprised to learn she hadn't returned. Since her cousin had spotted a gray SUV alongside the Cecil Jackson Bypass, Regina decided to drive out there to check for herself, and sure enough, Tarasha's Mazda Tribute was parked by the side of the road, facing the opposite direction. There was no trace of Tarasha or her cell phone at the scene, but two of the windows on the driver's side of the SUV were missing, and the driver's side door handle was broken. It also appeared like someone had been rummaging through the SUV, since stuff was scattered on the ground outside of it. This prompted Regina to contact the Selma Police Department in order to officially report her daughter missing. According to Regina, it was very out of character for Tarasha to disappear on her own, as she frequently checked in with her mother multiple times per day to let her know where she was. Tarasha's friends and family soon launched a massive search for her, which involved distributing missing persons flyers and asking numerous witnesses if they had seen Tarasha. The search effort was coordinated by Tarasha's cousin, Angela Benjamin, who was a city councilwoman for Ward 4, and the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children eventually got involved. Some vendors at the Selma Flea Market looked at Tarasha's missing persons flyer and thought they remembered having seen her on the morning she disappeared, but it was never conclusively established if Tarasha made it to the market or not. One witness contacted Regina and told her that he had seen Tarasha on the evening of June the 28th, several hours after she went missing. He claimed that Tarasha and two other girls were walking along Union Street near the Bosco Nutrition Center when a black Dodge Charger suddenly pulled up next to them. This prompted the two other girls to take off down an alley, but Tarasha decided to climb into the Charger before it drove off. Regina said that Tarasha was not the type of person who would climb into a vehicle with a stranger, so it was never confirmed if this witness actually saw her. One witness contacted Regina and told her that he had seen Tarasha on the evening of June the 26th, several hours after she went missing. He claimed that Tarasha and two other girls were walking along Union Street near the Bosco Nutrition Center when a black Dodge Charger suddenly pulled up next to them. This prompted the two other girls to take off down an alley, but Tarasha decided to climb into the Charger before it drove off. Regina said that Tarasha was not the type of person who would climb into a vehicle with a stranger, so it was never confirmed if this witness actually saw her. On June the 28th, 2 days after Tarasha went missing, a man named Wesley Bell contacted police and reported a strange incident in which he was driving down the road behind the Curb Market in Selmont, which is located on the south side of the Alabama River across from Selma. Bell claimed that he saw a former acquaintance from a work release program named Charles walking along the side of the road, so he pulled over and offered him a ride. However, Charles appeared to become spooked by this as he suddenly yelled out, quote, "I ain't done nothing," before running away into a wooded area near the railroad tracks. Bell got out of his vehicle and chased after Charles while yelling out, quote, "If you haven't done anything, what are you running for?" Bell wound up losing Charles, but he discovered that Charles had dropped a bloody towel while running away, so Bell contacted the authorities and turned the towel over to them as evidence. Police were unable to locate Charles, and I'm not even sure if they figured out his last name, but as far as I can tell, no conclusive link could be found between the bloody towel and Tarasha's disappearance. In another interesting turn of events, on the very same day as the incident with Charles, Tarasha Benjamin wound up getting arrested on an outstanding warrant for the charge of menacing, and she was held without bond at the Dallas County Jail. While some people found the timing to be suspicious, the Selma PD confirmed that Tarasha's arrest had nothing to do with Tarasha's case. Tarasha failed to resurface for the next 2 months, and on September the 16th, which should have been her 18th birthday, Tarasha's loved ones held a public gathering at Block Park, which was attended by more than 75 people, many of whom were wearing t-shirts sporting Tarasha's picture. In October of 2011, Regina appeared on an episode of The Maury Povich Show to spread awareness about her daughter's disappearance. A psychic also appeared on the show who had previously paid a visit to the Benjamin residence, and after entering Tarasha's bedroom, the psychic said that she had a feeling that Tarasha was not dead and was being held against her will. However, even though Tarasha's family had made trips to Florida to follow up on some reported sightings there, they were unable to find her. In August of 2015, Selma Police Chief William Riley resigned from his position to take on a new job in Michigan, but faced criticism that his department had not acted quickly enough when launching an investigation into Tarasha's disappearance, and her family felt that he should have brought in the Alabama State Police and the FBI for assistance. Over the years, there have been some uncorroborated accusations that the Selma PD orchestrated a cover-up in this case, and I'll be discussing that whole situation momentarily. In September of 2016, the Selma PD were contacted by the Dallas County Sheriff's Department, who had received a tip from an informant that one or two bodies, one of which possibly belonged to Tarasha, were buried behind an abandoned building that once housed a strip club called the Top Class Lounge and was located on the Cecil Jackson Bypass, not far from the spot where the SUV had been abandoned. The Alabama State Bureau of Investigation participated in a search of this area and used ground-penetrating radar to identify a couple of anomalies that they believed could have been buried bodies. But even though they spent several days digging up the area with a backhoe, no human remains were found. Regina often expressed her belief that Tarasha had become a victim of human trafficking and held out hope that she was still alive somewhere. But unfortunately, Regina passed away on September the 16th, 2023 at the age of 52 without receiving any answers about what happened to her daughter, and to make the situation even more tragic, her death occurred on what would have been Tarasha's 31st birthday. So after nearly 15 years, Tarasha Benjamin continues to remain a missing person. So I guess you could say the trail went cold. So before I start talking about this case any further, I should mention that a documentary about it titled Where is Tarasha Benjamin has apparently been in the works for a long time. It was being directed by an activist from Georgia named Lawyer Henderson, who first made an announcement about the project back in 2014, and the documentary even has its own page at the Internet Movie Database. There's also a 10-minute clip on YouTube featuring interview footage with people associated with the case, such as Tarasha's family and members of the Selma Police Department. I assumed this footage was going to be included in the documentary, but as far as I can tell, the film has never been completed, and I have no idea if and when it will ever be released. There is also a small blog about this case, which I'm assuming was written by Lawyer Henderson, and it contains a post from 2014 which names and directly accuses two people of being involved in Tarasha's disappearance. Since this information has not been corroborated by any other legitimate sources, I'm going to refrain from naming these people, and while the blog post is pretty confusing to read, it alleges that a police cover-up took place and that a former Selma police officer was responsible for what happened to Tarasha. You might recall that on the night she disappeared, Tarasha had supposedly been seen walking down the street with two other girls before she climbed into a black Dodge Charger. This blog post alleges that even though the Selma PD discounted this sighting, it was determined that the Charger was registered to an associate of Tarasha's who may have driven her to meet the person who harmed her. The blog also contains another post from 2018 which names a former Coast Guard officer as Tarasha's abductor, but again, I have no idea where this information is coming from, and it's never been verified by any other credible sources. I mean, I know that Tarasha's family have been critical of how the Selma PD handled the investigation and felt they should have sought help from the state police or the FBI, but as far as I can tell, they never flat out accused the police of a cover-up. If the Where is Tarasha Benjamin documentary ever comes out, it may shed some more light on these allegations, but for the moment, I'm going to avoid delving into conspiracy theory territory, and I'll only be analyzing the known facts about this case. Of course, one thing this story has in common with LaQuanta Riley's disappearance is that Tarasha also hailed from a family that had to endure a lot of tragedy. She lost two of her sisters in a house fire in 1996, and her own father, Clyde Chandler, went missing and was found dead less than 1 year before she vanished. In fact, there's a Reddit post about this case in which some commenters have speculated that these series of events are too much of a coincidence and wonder if the family may have been targeted by someone. In fact, there have even been accusations of Tarasha's mother, Regina Benjamin, possibly being complicit in her disappearance and all these other deaths, but I don't believe that for a second. Regina fought pretty diligently to keep her daughter's case in the spotlight, and her untimely death a year and a half ago at the age of 52 is just another tragic element in this whole saga. One news article I read about Tarasha's case seemed to make her father's death sound more mysterious, since Regina said that she wasn't sure what happened to him. But once it became apparent that Clyde was suffering from alcohol withdrawal syndrome and was uncontrollably shaking before he went missing, I concluded that there was likely no foul play involved in his death. Some people have found it odd that when Tarasha didn't return home by 11 a.m. on the morning of her disappearance, Regina mentioned having a gut feeling that something was wrong, so she started calling her cell phone and checking around with other friends and relatives to find out if they'd seen her, even though she had only been gone for about 2 hours. While that may seem a bit overprotective, it sounds like it was common practice for Tarasha to check in and frequently tell her mother where she was, and I really can't blame a woman who already lost her husband and 2 other daughters for having a bad gut feeling and becoming very concerned about her child's well-being if she was unable to reach her. There's also been suspicion directed towards Tarasha's friend Talisha Gavon, who lent Tarasha her SUV right before she went missing, and just happened to be arrested on an outstanding warrant for the charges of menacing 2 days later. But investigators have stated that the arrest had no connection to Tarasha's disappearance at all, and if you do a search on Talisha Gavon's name, you'll find that she's been mentioned in the Selma Times-Journal numerous times over the years for being arrested on a number of different charges, such as disorderly conduct, harassment, giving a false name to a police officer, and driving without a license. It sounds like Talisha is not exactly a model citizen, but that doesn't necessarily mean she was complicit in what happened to Tarasha. Of course, I do understand how it might seem suspicious that Talisha would allow Tarasha to borrow her SUV only for Tarasha to go missing and the SUV to be abandoned a very short time later. As you recall, Talisha was planning to drive Tarasha to the Selma Flea Market until something came up, and while I can't vouch for the veracity of this information, the aforementioned blog I just referenced does provide some more details about why they went their separate ways. Apparently, the two friends stopped at a local barbershop, and Talisha said she couldn't go to the flea market because she had to do another young lady's hair. So she offered Tarasha the use of her SUV and asked her to drop her off near the local fire department, where Talisha got into another car being driven by her sister-in-law. Talisha was then taken to Tarasha's house at around 1 p.m. and was expecting to collect her SUV, but was surprised to discover that Tarasha hadn't returned. So, looking at the timeline, different sources seem to have different information about the exact time Tarasha left her house that morning, but we know it was sometime between 9:30 and 10 a.m. Tarasha and Talisha went their separate ways a short time later, and one family friend said that she saw Tarasha driving the SUV alone through her neighborhood at around 10:30. And sometime after 11 o'clock, one of Regina's cousins informed her that they had seen an SUV matching this description parked alongside the Cecil Jackson Bypass with no one inside, a sighting which turned out to be accurate since Talisha's SUV was found at that exact spot hours later. It was abandoned only about a mile from the Selma Flea Market, but it's unclear if Tarasha ever made it there. I know that when her photograph was shown to some vendors at the flea market, they recalled having seen her, but for all we know, they could have mistook Tarasha for another young black woman, as I'm sure those vendors would have interacted with quite a few people on a Saturday morning. Whatever the case, it seems likely that something happened to Tarasha between 10:30 and 11 a.m. It's unclear if Tarasha or someone else parked the SUV next to the Cecil Jackson Bypass, but since it was facing the opposite direction one would normally drive, I have a feeling it was intentionally planted there. Now, I know a so-called psychic appeared on an episode of The Maury Povich Show and told Regina that her daughter was still alive and living in Florida, which led her to believe that Tarasha may have been a victim of human trafficking. I wasn't able to find a copy of this episode, and none of the sources I saw listed the psychic's name, but Sylvia Brown was still alive at that point, and this sounds exactly like something she would do. Regardless, I'm going to completely disregard the psychic's claims. I still don't know if Tarasha was alive for a period of time after the SUV was abandoned, because later that evening, witnesses supposedly saw Tarasha climbing into a black Dodge Charger on Union Street. I would ordinarily assume that the witnesses were mistaken, but we have a claim from that blog about the Charger being registered to an acquaintance of Tarasha's who may have played a role in her disappearance. My issue with this sighting is that from what I've heard about Tarasha, it would have been very out of character for her to just take off like this and ignore her family and friends. Regina claimed that when she tried calling Tarasha on her cell phone, all the calls went straight to voicemail, and since the phone has never been found, this implies that something happened to it. Furthermore, why would Tarasha just abandon her friend's SUV by the side of the Cecil Jackson Bypass? It would be one thing if she had been the victim of an abduction, but she was seen wandering around several hours later alongside two unidentified girls, so where would Tarasha have been during that time period? The other strange lead in this case was the eyewitness account from Wesley Bell, who claimed that 2 days after Tarasha went missing, he crossed paths with an acquaintance of his named Charles, who suddenly decided to run off into the woods and dropped a bloody towel. I get the impression that since they only knew each other from a work release program, Bell never learned Charles's last name, so I'm not sure if he was ever tracked down or identified. While there's nothing to suggest that Charles was involved in Tarasha's disappearance, I guess it would seem suspicious that he would have a bloody towel in his possession and then just decide to yell, quote, "I ain't done nothing," and run away so soon after a local girl went missing and a big search effort is taking place. But getting back to the blog I keep mentioning, none of the people called out as suspects there are named Charles, so this whole incident may not have any bearing on this case whatsoever. Anyway, since the abandoned SUV was found in a state of disarray, this suggests that something bad happened to Tarasha, but I've always been confused by one detail. It's been reported that it looked like someone had rummaged through the SUV, the driver's side door handle was broken, and that two of the windows on the driver's side of the truck were missing. I'm sorry, missing? None of the sources I've seen use the word broken, they specifically said missing. So does that mean that someone actually went to the trouble of removing two of the window panes? Was there no broken glass found at the scene? Removing entire window panes sounds like an awful lot of work, and I'm not sure something like this would happen if Tarasha had been the victim of a random predator. So this is one detail which could point towards some sort of cover-up and a concerted effort to destroy crucial evidence and stage the scene. The other odd lead in this case was the tip from the informant who claimed that the remains of one or two people, possibly Tarasha, were buried behind an abandoned building which used to house a strip club. I know that an excavation of this area failed to turn up anything, so perhaps this informant's story was completely bogus, but I'd really be curious to know who the other person or persons allegedly buried at that spot were supposed to be. It's been reported that the search was related to several ongoing missing persons cases, including Tarasha's. There are a lot of weird details and rumors about this case, but without more facts, I really can't express much of an opinion about what actually happened here. Sadly, the one thing I'm certain about is that Tarasha is likely no longer with us, and given the amount of tragedy her family have been forced to face, they definitely deserve some answers. So if you happen to have any information about the disappearance of Tarasha Benjamin, please contact the Selma Police Department at 334-874-2134. That's 334-874-2134. But if you just have your own thoughts about what happened, feel free to leave me a comment or send me an email to robin.warder@icloud.com. That's robin.warder@icloud.com. Now the reminder that The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so please visit patreon.com/thetrailwentcold to learn how you can support our podcast and become eligible for some pretty neat rewards. Over the course of nearly 7 years, our Patreon page has released around 80 exclusive bonus episodes, which are all currently available in our archives for our patrons in tiers 2 and 3. This past month, I released the audio of a panel session I participated in at the Berkshire Podcast Festival back in October titled Life in True Crime, which was moderated by Josh Hallmark of the True Crime Bullshit podcast and featured yours truly discussing my life in true crime podcasting alongside Charlie from Crime Lines, Lainey from True Crime Cases, and Robert Palmer from the Broken System podcast. I've also dropped an exclusive bonus episode from my spin-off podcast, The Path Went Chilly, in which myself and one of my co-hosts, Jules, discussed the 1979 murder of Deborah Jackson, a victim who was formerly an unidentified Jane Doe known only as Orange Socks. And for our patrons in Tier 3, I've recorded another new audio commentary track, which can be played over a classic episode of Unsolved Mysteries, and we now have over 70 of these commentary tracks in our archives. I'd also like to give a shout out to our most recent listeners who have signed up with us on Patreon this week, and they are Darren and Sue K. Thank you all so much for your support. I'd also like to remind everyone that in a month and a half, the Trail Went Cold will be appearing at a new event called Advocacy Con, which is taking place from March the 28th to the 30th at the Indianapolis Marriott East Hotel in Indianapolis, Indiana. It's being put together by fellow podcasters Eric from True Consequences and Melissa and Whitney from Navigating Advocacy, and is intended as a platform for the families of missing and murdered victims. We have a specialized promo code you can use to get a discount on tickets, so if you would like to attend, please visit their website, advocacycon.com, and use the code TRAIL10 to get 10% off. Once again, the website is advocacycon.com, and the promo code is TRAIL10 for 10% off tickets. I just wanted to give another shout out to my supporters at the Unsolved Mysteries message board at the Sitcoms Online forum and the Unresolved Mysteries subreddit. I need to provide a big thanks to Miguel Foote, who edits and assembles this podcast together for me, and Vince Nitro, who composed the eerie music you hear on every episode. If you haven't already, you can like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter and Instagram, or leave us a rating or review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, YouTube Music, Podcast Addict, or whatever your favorite podcasting platform is. Anyway, it's about that time again, as the Trail Went Cold is about to hit another milestone. That's right, next week we will officially reach our 9-year anniversary as a podcast, and to commemorate the occasion, for the first time ever, we'll be releasing an in-depth 3-part episode about a case which led to one of the most sensational trials of the 20th century. And so until then, have yourself a great week, and join us next Wednesday for the first part of our special 9th anniversary show of The Trail Went Cold.